Commissioner Nunn.
First off, well said, Commissioner Zinke. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the bipartisan members of this, and most importantly, thank you to the panel here today. I mean, this is just very powerful testimony that you've shared, not just in this committee room, but the rest of the world is watching. As we look at the lies and deception that are being facilitated by the Chinese Communist Party, this is not new to the realm of China. As a military officer, one of the first things that we read here is unrestricted warfare. The idea here that China is going to use every method to its ends to advance the goals of Beijing, not just on the battlefield, but right in its social media, in how it engineers its economy, and painfully, as you've highlighted, how it exploits its own people to achieve political goals, most notably retaining power within China and expanding that power across the world. Whether it be by most recently falsifying COVID statistics that lets the rest of the world unprepared for a vicious pandemic, telling the world that it's not interested in its territorial expansion while it gobbles up islands, or simply downplaying their military buildup in the Pacific across the area, China has become known as infamous when providing for the West false information. And it's truly broken down a trust that could have been established between Beijing and those of the rest of the world. Now, on the world stage, the United Nations Human Rights Council, China has fudged the numbers once again. However, the falsification here of human rights violation reported by the CCP not only shows they are lying, it indicates that those that are vulnerable populations, that they're not even worth accounting in their statistics internally to China. The Chinese Communist Party continues its efforts to lie about human rights violations that they themselves not only are allowing to have happen, but are actually the director of the infliction of pain that's incurred on it, as we just saw, Ms. Liu, from your testimony. So I want to applaud Chairman Smith, my fellow commissioners, for their continued efforts to hold Beijing's feet to the fire, not just in these committee hearings, but in the important legislation that has been moving forward on this that's now on the President's desk. This truly must be a comprehensive approach, not just from the United States, but that with our allies as well. So the bottom line is that if China wishes to amend its rocky relationship, not just with the West, but with the entire world, it needs to start by telling the truth and being transparent in that truth. So I'd like to get to our witnesses, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Rogers, I'll begin with you. Obviously, we have seen a dramatic transition in all of our lifetimes here in Hong Kong. One of the first things we saw is the extrajudicial procedures that were put in place to pull people out of Hong Kong in violation of the commitment that Beijing made to take them to courts outside. Could you speak to us briefly on how that has had a chilling effect on democracy in Hong Kong?
Thank you. Yes, the most significant development in the last year has been the issuing of arrest warrants and $1 million Hong Kong dollar bounties on the heads of now 13 Hong Kong activists, including those in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Australia. And certainly that has had a chilling effect. Some of those individuals who are courageous, long-standing activists have very understandably rethought how public they should be, not so much for their own safety, but because their family members in Hong Kong, after the issuing of these arrest warrants, were then called in for questioning. So the threat and the use of families of exiled activists in Hong Kong is a really horrific tactic by the CCP.
I want to dig one deeper here. Xi Jinping has identified religious work as being a priority. Can you talk to us what religious work in his mind would mean and what that impact has had on people across China?
Absolutely. This is his campaign of sinicization of religion. He's now made several unprecedented speeches. His predecessors as leaders of the Chinese Communist Party seldom, if ever, made speeches on religion. He's made now several. But what he means by Sinicization is not enculturation of religion. It's not about adapting religion to Chinese culture. It's about coercing religion to the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, to become a tool of the United Front work department, and to preach not the tenets of any particular religion, but rather the teachings of the Chinese Communist Party.
The religion of Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping alone. Ms. Abbas, you obviously are a religious minority. You represent the voice of so many millions who have been unheard inside China today. Could you talk to us both what the Chinese say publicly, again, going back to the lies and misdirection of religious freedom according to the law, and how China has used this according to the law standard to really suppress people using that law?
Thank you so much, Mr. Nunn. You are absolutely right. They define in the books and the Constitution that there are religious beliefs are guaranteed for the citizens. But with this recent campaign of the genocidal policies against the Uyghur ethnic group and the other, the Muslims in East Turkestan, we call Xinjiang province, the Chinese government is criminalizing every single aspect of the religion. Just like praying or fasting during Ramadan, or even saying a simple greeting of Salam Alaikum, which means peace be with you. Those are the reasons that Uyghurs can be detained. And they are using the pretext of war on terror and the de-radicalization and putting everyone in jail. We have millions of people disappeared in detention. My husband sitting behind me right now, his entire family went missing since summer of 2017, 24 people. My parents-in-laws, 3 of my sister-in-laws, their husbands, brother-in-law and his wife, 14 of his nieces and nephews. Then when I spoke out about this at the Hudson Institute in September 2018, my own sister, a retired medical doctor, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, she was taken as a retaliation for my freedom of speech, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. So when Cui Tiankai, one of the former Chinese ambassadors to United States, when he was questioned by one of the CNN reporters, he said it very clearly when he was asked about those detention centers. He said, by holding those Uyghurs in so-called re-education centers, we are trying to make them normal persons. So imagine, because of the language we speak, the religion we believe, and the beautiful culture that we represent, the front of the Chinese government's eyes, we are not even normal commodities. We are not even normal persons.
Yeah. Ms. Abbas, first of all, I think all the commissioners, our empathy to you as a fellow person of faith. Our prayers are with you, your husband's family. We can only pray for the best, but we also have to recognize the systematic elimination by the CCP is something that we equally have a responsibility here on Earth to address immediately. Dr. Dirks, I know you're remote with us, but I wanted to see if I could chime you in here to speak specifically to how China manipulates this data when it comes to its own domestic surveillance program. And I want to bring in the fact that it's not just the role of the United States. It's the role of the entire world to address internationally China's growing use of digital surveillance. We worked hard on the Huawei prevention bill and the efforts that China is using technology to spy on the West. It is probably even more invasive inside China and really has provided a testing ground for the CCP to hone its ability to surveil, assess, and ultimately detain or destroy its own population, a tactic that could quite easily be used on operatives outside of China. Would you be able to speak to that, Dr. Dirks?
Certainly. So I just want to say thank you to members of the Commission, as well as members of the Tibetan diaspora, specifically Students for Free Tibet, people at Human Rights Watch, and other researchers who focused on the specific issue. We're talking about domestic surveillance in China, the specific issue of mass DNA collection. I wrote a report on this in late September, or in September of 2022, as did Human Rights Watch. And this led to a lot of pressure being placed on a US-based company, Thermo Fisher, which was implicated in the mass DNA collection program in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And it was because of the public efforts, again, of members of this commission, as well as Tibetan diaspora groups, that ultimately led Thermo Fisher to make the decision to cease selling human identification kits within the Tibet Autonomous Region, just as they did in Xinjiang in 2019. So what I think this highlights is that there is a large role, an important role to be played by people in the public sector, in civil society, in the media, researchers, as well as members of legislatures and liberal democracies, to put pressure on both Chinese and non-Chinese companies for their involvement in these kind of programs. Secondly, when we're talking about the expansion of Chinese state surveillance, perhaps outside of its borders, I think where we see the greatest risk is to members of diaspora communities. So these could be Chinese, Hong Kong, Uyghur, Tibetan, or others, individuals who by citizenship are Chinese or because of their family ancestry have links to China. And we've certainly seen under the Xi Jinping administration a real increase in efforts by the Chinese government to harass, intimidate, attack, and even forcibly return members of these communities back to China. So if we're thinking about solutions, if we're thinking about how to address these problems, I think we really need to be thinking about those particular diaspora communities and vulnerable members of those communities. There's a lot of discussion today about political prisoners. Deserve a discussion. These are people who are under intense surveillance, detention, abuse within China's borders. Many of the diaspora members who are being targeted by the Chinese government outside of China are often quite anonymous. These are not well-known individuals, right? And so I think it requires a great sensitivity, a lot of training on the part of US government officials, again, specifically, as I said in my remarks, law enforcement, immigration, to be able to correctly recognize what transnational repression is, including its digital component, the harassment, intimidation of people online, and how to provide necessary and reasonable support to individuals and their families. And that will also require a lot of trust building between law enforcement agencies, immigration, and those members of those communities and the communities at large.
Thank you, Dr. Dirks. And I think it's worth noting here that the tactics that are being honed, as you highlighted, within China's borders have already spilled over to the diaspora in other countries. In fact, right here in the United States, we were proud to just pass legislation shutting down 40,000 Chinese shell companies that have set up shop. I'm a farm kid from Iowa. It's not just the buying of farmland, it is the whole-scale establishment of a clandestine operation working here in the United States and around the world, buying up so that it can target its own diaspora, but also be a collection agent for U.S. interests on our own soil. This is an immediate national security concern. And while our hearts are absolutely with everyone in this room, we have to recognize the CCP does not intend to operate only on Chinese soil, but to export that directly to be able to influence activities around the globe. Ms. Mboden, you have led some very important recommendations here on what the United States can do. I think that it's important, as we saw with Huawei and other technologies, that in that technology space alone, it cannot be one country trying to turn back this red tide. And I'm not talking about Alabama football. I'm talking about what's coming out of Beijing right now. The reality is, if we're going to move forward on this, how do we get our other international partners to come alongside the good recommendations you've made for what we're trying to do here in the United States?
That's an excellent question. I have said that transnational repression needs a transnational response. I think that there are many countries that are starting to understand the threat that this presents. Australia, for example. I've also noticed a real change within Europe, where China experts themselves have started to face some level of transnational repression. And so I think those governments are starting to understand the risks. So I would encourage the U.S. to pursue within the UN and other bodies joint resolutions, shared initiatives to combat transnational repression, UN Human Rights Council resolution on transnational repression, information sharing between federal agencies, especially law enforcement, on transnational repression. I would also like to see the United States government, I'll say that I think at the federal level, the U.S. has made great strides in recognizing it, but I think that it needs to be much broader and include also state-level officials being aware of transnational repression. I would also like to see, frankly, the UN security understand transnational repression because, as my fellow witness indicated, on UN grounds, people feel threatened by Chinese representatives from gongos, and I think that isn't really not excusable. 5 years ago, many of us started making recommendations to the UN on what UN security could do, and I don't think that has been implemented to date.
I want to thank each member of the panel here and highlight specifically, Ms. Moden, to your point, both what we can do at the international level, but as you highlighted, at the federated state levels here as well to have a unified front. And Mr. Rogers, as you noted earlier, those bilateral relationships with countries that have the capacity to stand up, Australia, the United States, Japan, Korea, Great Britain certainly. These are the countries that have to lead the way. The United States has certainly been on board with this, but we have to stand with our neighbors in communities that don't have the ability to stand on their own. And I look at some of our friends in Southeast Asia, and the island nations, they need the support as well, with the largest percentage of Chinese living in those communities that also face this direct threat, both economically, socially, religiously, but most importantly, politically as well. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Nunn, thank you very